What's your favourite spot, location on campus? The spot, the location that inspires you in your walk with God. Maybe it's the stoop, maybe it's the SRC, conservatory, art gallery, maybe Fisher Dorm, foyer area, 10:30 at night. What inspires you when you sit down in this location? For me, the location that inspires me here at Wheaton College campus is the rotunda in the Billy Graham Centre Museum. So you go through the doors of the Billy Graham Centre and you come into the museum area and you come into this round, huge, round room, 20-foot ceilings with 10 banners the size of the ones on your left and right. And they are declaring the faithful journeys of people like St. Paul, St. Francis of Assisi, Justin Martyr, Martin Luther, John Wycliffe, John Wesley, John Sung. But the banner that speaks to me is the banner of a woman, and it's the only woman of 10 in the banners. Pandita Ramabai, Indian, 1858 to 1922. Came from a Hindu background, committed her life to Jesus as a follower of Jesus when she was in her early 20s, and devoted her life to child widows and child marriage, to release children from being forced to marry at an extremely young age. So her own father had multiple wives. At 40 years of age, he married a 9-year-old girl. One time during a famine, around 1900, she and her workers went through village after village collecting dying, starving little children, widows at 8, 9, 10 years of age. That year she had 1,500 children she looked after. In humble surrender, she gave up power in order to love. She was an amazing scholar, knew 7 languages, was an international expert on Sanskrit. She gave up that power, surrendered it to love her fellow human beings. I'm minded of Pandita Ramabai this morning as an inspiration, speaking to me as a woman who follows Jesus, as a man who wants to desire to follow Jesus. She speaks to me this morning, as does Esther here in chapter 4. There are parallels between Pandita Ramabai and Esther. The book of Esther is about God. Every book of the Bible is about God. God is not mentioned specifically by name, but it's about God. It's about His sovereignty. It's about His all-powerfulness. He is the King of all kings. And He is orchestrating the deliverance of His people. And He's in the midst of and living in the midst of the suffering of His people. That's what the book of Esther is about. You begin the first couple of chapters of Esther, and you've got Xerxes, Persian king, 485, 465 BC. He's powerful, he's all-powerful, he's petulant, he's proud, he's thin-skinned, he's spending months and months showing his power and majesty and glory, and he's a buffoon, he's a fool. He's got a concubine harem of hundreds of women that are his sex slaves. Sex trafficking is not new. Hundreds. He puts his queen aside, Vashti, out of being challenged. And he brings about a beauty contest, an international Persian Empire beauty contest. And his soldiers come through the villages and rip out of their locations from their families without any choice. They had a choice. You go with the soldiers to the palace, in the bubble of the palace of the sex-addicted king, or you die. That's the choice. This is the background to Esther chapter 4. Esther is a sex slave in the courts, in the palace, prison, within a concentration camp in the Persian Empire, and she's at the whim of a fool, a eccentric fool, who puts her and the other contestants in the beauty contest through 12 months of different cosmetic preparations, and then they are brought into him for a few moments of sexual gratification. That's the context of Esther. She's a prisoner. She's a sex slave. She has no choice. But God gives her poise. God gives her wisdom just by her words and deeds. And I looked at chapter 4, as you heard it read this morning, of Esther, and I see in her qualities of leadership that we desperately need in this 21st century. Yes, a woman leader speaking to me and you. From the 5th century BC. This is what I see. Steps of surrender where she surrenders humbly power in order to love. The first thing that hit me was her empathy. So she's in a bubble. She's in a prison. She doesn't hear anything from the outside. The only way she can hear things from the outside is send her faithful concubine messenger. And she hears that Mordecai, the cousin, is in ashes and sackcloth. And this is what it says in New American Standard. She writhes in anguish when she hears about what's happening to her cousin and her fellow Jewish people. She writhes in anguish, deeply distressed, the empathetic joining together with her own people. God help me. I don't do that. I'm just inundated through global media about the suffering of humanity. It doesn't touch me. I'm numb to it. And then the compassion she shows in wanting to do something, she sends clothes to him in compassion so he can get out of his sackcloth. The next thing I see is that she's willing to gather information. She doesn't know what's going on. Empathy, compassion, and she's teachable. We need leaders in the church and in the secular world that are teachable. She gathers information. And then she's real in the toing and froing as Mordecai explains to her the edict and the price that Haman puts on the eradication of all the Jewish people in the Persian Empire. You know the story. After she learns and is informed, she's real, she's authentic. She confesses. She confesses, I'm weak. Everybody in Persia knows that if you go into the inner court of Xerxes I and he is not favorable to you, you will lose your head unless he tips out the golden scepter. She's real in her confession. And then Mordecai sends the message, three-pronged. Don't think you're going to escape. You're dead, and your family is dead. You're not going to escape in the palace bubble. And if you don't take up this position of speaking on behalf of your people and asking for mercy and clemence, God's going to raise up, and God is not mentioned, but there's the strong awareness as you are the audience listening that it's God. God is going to raise up someone else that will be the deliverer if you don't conform. And then what Sarah read this morning, the third part, don't you realize that God is behind all this? And He's placed you, planted you in the palace for such a time as this? As you are planted, there's no coincidence you're sitting here this morning. God has orchestrated it, whether you're aware or not. What are you going to do with the next 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, 4 year? As the Holy Spirit speaks to you, chapel after chapel, discipleship group after discipleship group, prayer committee group, what are you going to do with the voice? The Holy Spirit is speaking to you. I've got no doubt about that. She listens. Empathetic, compassionate, teachable, confessional. She listens to what he says. And she humbles herself. She calls a fast. 3-day. Servants within the palace, as well as encouraging Mordecai to communicate to all the Jewish community in Susa, the capital. You need to fast for me if I'm going to go into the king, to live or die. It's a humbling fasting and prayer. You don't have fasting without surrender in prayer too. It's declaring her surrender, her yielding, her bending the knee to the King of Kings, not to Xerxes, but she's aware that God is in control. She calls a fast. In fasting you pray. And then the famous expression of total surrender. If I perish, I perish. There was a process. You don't move from writhing in anger at the news of the destruction coming to totally surrender with, if I perish, I perish. That does not happen overnight. That's a process of God's dealing, bringing about layers of leadership integrity. We need leaders in our communities, including Wheaton College, like Esther. We need empathetic, teachable, listenable, confessional, real, authentic people that will humble themselves before God, our Lord, and surrender our lives to Him. I had the privilege just this last 12 months to go to 4 countries in our world that are creative access, meaning you declare you're Jesus follower and you've got a good chance of losing your life and your family. If you don't lose your life, you'll get thrown into prison. I can't give names, I can't give locations, but I'll give you 3 thoughts. Contemporary examples of a Pandita Ramabai that still speaks, and Esther that still speaks, that brings about leadership qualities that God is speaking to us about. Where are you strong? What qualities of leadership that you see in Esther? Where are you strong? Where are you weak? Empathetic, compassionate, confessional, you're listenable, you're teachable, or you're not teachable, or you don't listen. You just ride over people and use your power of leadership, position, status, title to do what you want rather than the purposes of God in your generation. Where are you weak? Where are you strong? Where you're weak, we need God's help to be the leaders, men and women that He wants. At our college, Chicagoland, our nation, and the world. This lady sharing how when she started following Jesus, moving from one religion to allegiance with Jesus, her brothers and father tied her up and beat her, hoping to kill her because she declared Jesus was Lord. I spoke to her. I listened to her a few months ago. Miraculously, she escaped. I'm in the Intercultural Studies department in the grad school. Over the 20 years that I've been there, we've had 1,000 or more alumni that have gone through our programs, MA TESOL, MA Intercultural Studies, and certificate, an MA Accelerator. Over 1,000, 80% would be women. mainly because they were restricted in ministry and using the gifts and the calling of God in the Western world. Because of a half a verse here and a half a verse there that men use as power weapons to squash down 50% of the church. You are being taught by a woman this morning. Her name is Esther. And she's teaching us, men and women, how to live as a leader in the 21st century. She is teaching us this morning. An alum in the Middle East, alumna, started Christian schools in the Middle East, deported, kicked out of one, moved into another. Her heart attitude, this alumna I'm thinking of, is if I perish, I perish. In a few weeks' time, we have Ruth Padilla divorced. Born in Colombia, raised in Argentina, 1997, with her first husband and 2 little children. They were robbed beside the road in a Latin American country. They were taken out of the car. And with her 2 little children and carrying her 3rd child, she saw her husband executed on the side of the road before her eyes and before her family because they followed Jesus. What has this done for Ruth Padilla divorced? It's made her aware of the senseless suffering in the world and the viciousness of our world, and made her acutely aware that God is in the midst of our suffering. She's coming to campus. She's coming to a Wednesday undergrad chapel, October 5 and 6, speaking at our Gratian lectureship on Thursday night. You will hear her, a woman who declares with Esther and Pandita Ramabai, if I perish, I perish. My favourite spot on campus is the Rotunda, Billy Graham Centre Museum. And on the banner are these words: the only thing that must be done by me is to tell people of Him. My favourite quote from Pandita Ramabai is a prayer that we need to put in our hearts this morning. And she says, and still speaks to us as Esther speaks to us, a life totally committed to God has nothing to fear, nothing to lose, nothing to regret. A life totally committed to God has nothing to fear, nothing to lose, nothing to regret.